Hi everybody. This is a video on authorship and ethics, and I really wanted to do this video because I really think it's important that you learn at some point in time what the best practices for authorship are. Then we're going to do some case studies, and at the end I'll talk to you about how they're really hard to put into practice. So on the surface it seems simple enough, right? When we write the authors on a paper, we usually list them in a certain order. Typically, the first author is the one who's done the most work, right? Probably collected most of the data, wrote the first draft of the paper, etc., etc. The last author or the corresponding author is usually the professor, right? That's the person who probably funded the work, advised the student, etc., etc. And then people who made more minor contributions are in the middle. So the person who did the second most experiments is usually second and third most, etc., etc. So, we're listing our major contributions and the descending order of involvement in the project. But there's a lot of gray areas in this. What is a major contribution? Other people now say, instead of waiting until afterwards, especially if you're in a collaboration, maybe you should assign the authorship before even the first pipette has been picked up and we've done the experiments, but then you don't really know maybe what's going to come out and what's the most important. So there are some places that have established standards and practices. One is the International Committee of the Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJE. You'll see that in my slides later. They have some standards and best practices. And I also want to remind people that authorship extends beyond published papers, but also to abstract and conference proceedings and presentations and even dissertations. I can't tell you how many times the first time my students submit an abstract to a scientific conference, they forget to put my name on it. They usually don't do it more than once, because one of my students once, when he forgot to put my name on it, said nobody came by my poster because they didn't know I was from your group. But it's sort of funny because it's like, well, it's my poster. And they forget that they should be putting many people's names on it and giving credit to everybody who's been working on the project. And in a dissertation, you should definitely delineate the work of others, right? Now, many papers and projects are multidisciplinary, and you might have had help, but somewhere either in the first page of the chapter or up front, you should delineate, the gel on page 30 was collected by Susie, and, et cetera, et cetera. So if you didn't do it, you should just delineate that. And then my own personal policy in my own lab, it might differ a little bit, but if you don't write it, you can't include it in your dissertation. So again, we all write collaborative papers now, but if you were the second author and you really didn't write those words, the first author did, I don't allow my students to put that in their dissertation as their own chapter. Now, they can pull out their own work and rewrite it. I'm fine with that. So if they did a lot of work, on a part of a paper, but they were second author, they can put that in their dissertation. But in my opinion, a dissertation is really your own writing, and so it should not be anything that was really started by and written by others. Okay, so why does authorship matter? I apologize. All these slides are just, tons of words today, so sorry about that. Authorship really matters. In case you haven't realized this, authorship is the basically scientific kind of credit system. And so it means that you did something important enough to be considered a person that should get credit for the paper. And so that has academic, social, and financial implications, right? Academically, if you want to get a job, you want to have papers that you're an author on. Socially, maybe it's a Nature paper that you can say you were first author on, et cetera, et cetera. And financially, quite frankly, I'm not going to get grants, right, if I don't write papers. And so it matters what papers you're writing. It matters that you're an author. And so it's a very serious thing. Authorship also implies responsibility and accountability. It means that, and we'll see this, that you are supposed to basically be a check that the work was done responsibly under all of the ethical rules, right? That you're accountable, that work was not cheated upon, that the data was collected correctly, that kind of thing. And because that's a little bit difficult, because sometimes maybe you do a small part of the experiment and somebody else does a larger part, and you don't really know what they did for the larger part. Many journals now request and publish information about the contributions of each person. Okay, well, if this person collected the data for figures 1 through 3, and this person collected the data for figures 4 and 5. And at least that gives you a little bit of an out if, well, I collected 1 to 3, but it was, figure 4 that was totally fake. But not fully absolving you. As much as possible, when a paper goes out with your name on it, you should try and check out the data to the best that you can. All right, so here are the authorship recommendations. That to be an author, you should do all 4 of these. That you should have a substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data for the work. So that's the first one. That you should either have kind of planned and designed it, or you should have acquired the data, maybe analyzed it or interpreted it. Number 2, though, is that you should have had help. You should have a hand in drafting the work or revising it critically for an important intellectual content. And you should have approved the final version to be published. And you agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work and ensuring the questions related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. So that's that high calling. Number 4, you're responsible for the paper. Not just your little part. And the problem is they don't want people just to be responsible for their little part, because that means that you're kind of like resolving them of the fact that they don't have to be critical of the other people's data that they're kind of working with and collaborating with. So this is a pretty high standard and actually kind of hard to meet sometimes. Again, sorry, I took this from their recommendations, and so it's a wall of text, and I'm sorry. But an author should be able to identify which co-authors are responsible for specific parts of the work, and they should have confidence and integrity. Designated authors should meet all 4 criteria, and if you do, then you should be there. If you don't meet all 4 criteria, you should be acknowledged instead in the acknowledgments rather than the authors. But then they give this caveat that if you meet number 1, remember number 1, if we went back, is that substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work or acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data. So if you're really substantially involved in the project, you're right then to be involved in number 2 and 3, which is writing the paper and approving it. So you shouldn't take away that, well, they didn't help write the paper or approve it, and use that as an excuse not to make somebody an author. The corresponding author is usually the PI, your professor, and they take a special role. They obviously correspond with the journal, manuscript, peer review, and that kind of thing. But there's also these administrative requirements. Sometimes the students, you don't even see them. I sign copyright forms. I sign author and ethics approvals, and conflict of interest statements and that kind of thing. They also are responsible during submission and peer review, but quite frankly after that as well, to respond to any critiques of the work. If somebody says, I don't think this is valid, or sometimes people ask you for research samples or for the data, that kind of thing. And so that's why the professor is usually the corresponding author, because sometimes years later people ask you, can I reuse this figure? Can I have the data for that figure? And they're responsible for being able to correspond with people about the work. And also the ones that are most responsible if there is an ethical inquiry from an editor or that kind of thing for handling it. So what are non-author contributions then, if you don't meet all 4 of these? And so they give some examples here. Just acquiring funding. That's an awfully difficult one, because usually acquiring funding, it often has experimental design in it too. But if it's just that, maybe no. General supervision of a research group or general administrative support. So again, there may be some labs with a lab manager or something that manages it but didn't really work on that specific project. And then writing assistance, technical editing, language editing, proofreading. So that doesn't also count. Again, they're not enough critical work. This last one is interesting, and I have to admit I've never done it. These are the rules from the ICMJE or whatever, because acknowledgement may imply endorsement, you should tell everybody before you acknowledge them and get them to consent. Never done it. But if there is somebody that you think is going to object to being acknowledged for some reason, it would be nice if there's a reason, if you're acknowledging somebody, that you maybe would show them the paper draft ahead of time. It's kind of an interesting question. So disputes in authorship. What if people claim that they were left off and they should have been an author, or perhaps included and they didn't want to be, they didn't agree with the data, that kind of thing. The journal people said, hey, guess what? We're not settling that. The home institution should settle that. And we do have an Office of Research Integrity on campus that would be the kind of place that you could file something that you were not happy with authorship and not getting authorship. But it's often a real gray area as to what you need to do. And it might differ from lab to lab and what you need to be an author. So that was the journal editor guidelines. What's the NIH guidelines? They say that you should have a significant contribution to the conceptualization, design, execution, and or interpretation, and as well as a willingness to assume some responsibility. So that's about the same. And there's a problem in there. There's kind of two problems. The first is gift authors. Authors that maybe don't deserve to be on the paper, but are, usually because they have some stature or authority. So oftentimes, I mean, I have to admit, I've published a paper with a Nobel Prize winner. I've never met him. I don't think he read the paper. Like, he made some mice that we had. Quite frankly, if he hadn't been a Nobel Prize winner, we probably would have just acknowledged that he gave us the mice. But they thought we should put him on the paper, right? You know, and so I was back in graduate school. It was hard for me to really know or maybe dispute it. But people tend to do that. There are some places, France is one, China is one, sometimes Germany, where there's kind of a big hierarchy of structure where there's the head person and then they have other professors underneath of them, and you wouldn't dare publish a paper without the head person on it. Even if you look, the head person maybe is on 40 papers a year. They probably aren't making much of a contribution, but that's the way the lab is set up. Technically, that's gift authorship. It's happened for a while. I don't know that it's going to stop, but they should really be involved in the project and not just, well, that's the head of the lab, but there's all these professors working under them. It'd be like me, the chair of the department, getting on everybody's paper in the department. That's wrong. I don't need to be on your paper, right? I didn't contribute to it. But it happens. I'm just going to let you know that it happens in certain places. The other problem is ghost authors, people who do a significant amount of work but are not given authorship. Maybe there's a writer involved, but a lot of times there's this status problem in science. A technician, they did a lot of the work, maybe came up with something creative, but you say, well, I told them what to do, so they don't get to be an author. And a lot of different labs have different theories on that. You could put undergraduates in that same technical status. Should they be an author or not? Did you tell them just what to do, but they did it? Did they significantly contribute? It's a really hard problem to kind of know. So best practices. Decide author order as the project is started. Theoretically, the problem is projects wander, as I said. But especially if you're doing something collaborative, you probably ought to decide who will be first author and corresponding author and get it in writing. Sometimes that might be that you decide that there should be two. They now will let you put a star and put somebody as the co-first authors. But, being second co-first author is never quite as good as being first co-first author, right? Who gets their name first. So you kind of think about that ahead of time. And also just there's a lot of competing interests. It's often hard to be exactly fair to everybody in a negotiation. That, you did this part and they did that part, and whose part was more important. It's not always easy. Sometimes when I think about it, and I'll talk about this later, I try and think about the career stage and who needs something more. And that's not really fair, but, I try and be fair over time. I also try and be fair, if I'm collaborating with like an assistant professor, I'll let them be last. I'm already a full professor. Doesn't really matter to me most of the time, so I try and be fair in that respect. The best practice is to decide the author order when writing the paper. Right, and I think that's a really good time. As it goes down on the paper, you should decide who is the authors, right, who really did significant contributions. That way they can really contribute as you're writing. As I said, that was point number 2. And practically you have a better idea of who did what and, how to order the authors. But the problem with this, as I said, is it may be too late for someone to feel heard about their contribution. They think, I worked really hard, And they thought maybe their authorship or their rank was going to be higher, and now it's not, and you have to make hard decisions. And so I don't know. I mean, there's pros and cons. I think different studies lend themselves to different author orders. But if you think that you should be an author, I would say when the paper is being written, if nothing else, you need to speak up. If you think they're leaving you off, that is the time to speak up, because you should then contribute to the paper in some way when it's being written. But if you're, worried about it, speak to your PI. Speak to somebody. Again, you can go higher up in the department or to the research office if you think you're not being heard. But it's really a tricky subject sometimes. Sorry. Allergies. I'm pretty sure I don't have COVID. All right, so I just thought I'd put a couple case studies. We're not going to do these in the case studies, but I want you to see what the problem is. Jane realizes there's an effect A in her experiments, and she does preliminary experiments to try and figure out what the cause of the effect A is. But she graduates, and Peter takes over the project. Peter works diligently for 2 years to determine the cause of the effect of A, and is now going to write the paper. What is the authorship for Jane and for Peter? Right? Jane was the first to see this effect, right? So sometimes I've had this happen in my lab where Jane says, well, obviously I should be the first author because I discovered it. But the reality is Peter probably worked longer and harder to really figure it out in this case. If it was my lab, I'd probably pick Peter as the first author, not Jane. But it's really hard. This is where feelings get hurt. But I discovered it, yes, but then he did more work to figure it out. In fact, there was a paper when I left graduate school. I left it done, but then the reviewers wanted a whole bunch more experiments. It took the guy like a year to finish him up. But when the paper came out and I was first author, I was actually embarrassed. I was like, wow, I wish they'd switched the author, or I'm a little bit embarrassed that he spent way more longer, I think, on the project than I did. It's sometimes tough. But this is where, the gray lines kind of happen. This is on case study number 2. Undergraduate Don has collected a lot of data for graduate student Sam, testing various conditions that the experiment works best. Sam uses this data in his thesis and eventual publication. Don is long gone by the time the paper is submitted. What is Don's authorship contribution? I think we all probably agree that if Don did a bunch of experiments optimizing, he probably qualifies as an author. The problem often is that you can't have Don then do 2 and 3, right? Don probably didn't help write the paper. Don didn't necessarily approve it to be submitted. I've had this come up numerous times in my labs that I don't even have an email address for the undergrad anymore. And yet I don't want to necessarily leave them off because they did do important work. And so it's important, I think, to think about all of the people who contributed, especially some of the early people, and do your best to involve them if you can. And then the last one is we work with the Chow lab to come up with some exciting fly studies. We do all the neurochemistry, and they make all the genetic contracts and do some accompanying histochemistry and imaging studies. Amy from our lab is the lead, while Stella from the Chow lab is their lead. Who should write the paper and be first author, corresponding author, and when should this be negotiated? This is an example of, I think, when you should have negotiated ahead of time. We are working together. We have a contribution, they have a contribution. It's hard to say whose contribution is more important, right? This may be a case where you do have co-first authors and co-corresponding authors. Or maybe if there's going to be, oftentimes what I use, if there's going to be 2 papers, it's perfect, because maybe Amy can be the lead on one and Stella the lead on the next one. But there's not always 2 papers, right? And so we have to negotiate these things. But this is a case with a collaboration, especially where I think negotiating up front might have been helpful. Okay, so here are my own group policies, just so you know. I'm not sure they're everybody's group policies, but in general, the person who does the most experiments and writes the paper is the first author. In my lab, we occasionally share first author, but it's not usually my preference. Almost never do 2 people actually equally write a paper, right? Usually one person writes a paper and the other person contributes some. So if you're going to actually write the paper, I'm usually going to give you the credit. I try to be fair to everyone involved, but I know that's not always possible. Again, when I look over somebody's career, I'm hoping they'll publish 3 or 4 papers in my lab, and I will try and even it out. But I have had lots of hurt feelings in my lab over this. Like, well, I was the one who came up with the idea, but I was the one who did all the experiments. Again, I think ideas are cheap in a way, and if you just came up with the idea, I don't think you can expect to get a first author paper out of it. Again, if you didn't do the experiments, somebody has to do the experiments in life, right? I just don't think an idea itself gets you a first author paper. I do try and stick up for my people, though, in their careers when negotiating with other people, making sure that we don't get always just put at the end or not important. But sometimes we only do one experiment. We're going to be in the middle of a list of authors. It just is what it is. And again, thinking empathy, and you understand the career needs of other people. I've had people in my office before telling me I need to be first author on this paper because I need it to graduate and get the job that I want. But then they're arguing against another person who needs to be first author in the paper because they want to go to med school, and having a first author paper is going to really look good on their CV for med school. And it's sort of disheartening when they can't see that other people have career needs too, right? Normally career needs is not what drives who gets to be first author. I don't give first author to somebody because they want to be an academic and the other person wants to go to industry, so it doesn't matter. That's a really poor practice in my mind. But on the other hand, you should have some empathy. Don't be don't be too squishy. If you just always give in, I wouldn't always give in. But if you can't see that other people have some needs too, it's going to be difficult when negotiating authorship. And then the last thing is just to go over time. Again, I try and make everybody get contributions. In my lab, I have the Payfor principle. Sometimes you're going to be asked to finish a project started by other people who left. But someday, hopefully, somebody will finish your project for you. You often don't get the credit that you wish for finishing somebody's project, right? You might only get second or third authorship because they did most of the work. But it is one of those inevitable things in a lab that people leave, their paper is not yet accepted, and we've got to kind of finish it up. I do think all students should have the opportunity to write their own papers. I really think you should push for that. That's what helps you learn to be a scholar. Don't be letting the professor just write all the papers. It doesn't teach you what you need to do. And then, again, when writing a paper, we're only talking about authorship here, but you need to adhere to a high standard of ethics in all of the publishing process, from data collection to interpretation to authorship, right? It does you no good to fight to be an author on a paper where the data was all faked, right? Where the interpretation is off and you didn't really think about it, et cetera, et cetera. So you really need to think about all the parts of the paper as you go along. All right, I hope that helps you, and I hope you enjoy this week's case studies.